Hey, did you know that one of England's most shocking and gruesome royal deaths took place almost 700 years ago? King Edward II's death was so horrible and humiliating that it's still remembered today as one of the darkest moments in English history. It's the kind of story that makes you question the brutal world of medieval politics. Today, we're going to explore the terrifying tale of how a king met his tragic end. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll know why this death is still talked about in history classes and beyond. Let's rewind to the early 14th century, an era where kings ruled with absolute power, and a single misstep could mean the end of a dynasty. Edward II, born in 1284, was the son of the fierce and formidable King Edward I, also known as Longshanks. Edward I was a king who was larger than life, a warrior king whose battles against Scotland were legendary. His reign was defined by conquest, strength, and an iron-fisted grip on power. He built an empire that seemed unshakable, and his name was feared and respected throughout England and beyond. But Edward II was not his father. Edward II, who inherited the throne in 1307 after his father's death, was a complete opposite of the strong, calculating Edward I. From the beginning, it was clear that Edward II didn't possess the same natural leadership qualities. He was more gentle, more interested in courtly matters than the hard realities of ruling a kingdom. He lacked the military expertise and political savvy that his father had, while Edward I had been known for his strategic mind and ability to keep his nobles in check. Edward II seemed to alienate those around him, making enemies rather than allies. This weakness didn't go unnoticed. Edward II inherited a fractured kingdom, one that had been built through his father's conquests, but one that required strong leadership to maintain unity and control. The English nobility, who were used to wielding power in their own territories, saw Edward II's failure to govern effectively as a sign of weakness. Instead of rallying behind him, they began to plot against him. The cracks in Edward's rule started to show immediately, and they would widen as his reign continued. Now, it's important to understand that medieval kings were not only rulers, they were also symbols of the power and authority of their kingdom. For a king to lose the support of his nobles was to lose everything. And in Edward II's case, it wasn't just nobility who turned against him. His failure to govern would also cost him the love and loyalty of his own wife. Edward's relationship with his wife, Isabella of France, began as a diplomatic marriage, arranged to solidify an alliance between England and France. But over time, their marriage became one of the most tumultuous and damaging royal unions in history. Isabella was a strong-willed woman from a powerful royal family. She had been raised in a court where power was everything, where kings and queens ruled with authority and decisiveness. But her marriage to Edward II, a man who seemed incapable of leading his kingdom, proved to be deeply frustrating for her. As time went on, Isabella's frustration with her husband's reign grew. She saw him as weak, indecisive, and unable to maintain control over his own court. And what made matters worse was the growing influence of a man named Piers Gaveston. Now, let me tell you about Gaveston, because this man would play a key role in the downfall of Edward II. Piers Gaveston was a man of humble origins, but he quickly became one of Edward II's most trusted companions and confidants. Their bond was strong, perhaps too strong. Edward and Gaveston were inseparable, and their relationship became the center of political and social tensions within the court. Edward showered Gaveston with wealth, titles, and lands, things that normally would have gone to most powerful nobles in England. Gaveston became so influential that he was often seen as a power in his own right, and this enraged the English nobility. The nobles saw Gaveston as an outsider, a man unworthy of the influence he held over the king. Now, to make matters worse, Edward II didn't just ignore the anger of his nobles. He refused to listen to them. He continued to support Gaveston, despite the growing resentment of his court. Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston was seen as an act of defiance, one that alienated his allies and made him enemies in his own court. The nobles, feeling disrespected and disregarded, began to grow restless. The very people who should have been his allies were now his adversaries. In 1312, the situation reached a boiling point. The nobles, led by Thomas of Lancaster, a powerful cousin of the king, seized Gaveston and forced him into exile. But Edward II, still loyal to his friend, refused to let him go. Instead of letting the situation die down, Edward brought Gaveston back into the kingdom. This was seen as a slap in the face to the nobles. They were fed up, and this time they decided that enough was enough. Gaveston was captured again, and this time the nobles made sure there would be no more escapes. They executed him in a brutal manner, and his death became a symbol of Edward II's failure as king. The execution of Gaveston was a direct challenge to Edward's authority, and it sent a message that the nobles would no longer tolerate his rule. Edward's reaction to Gaveston's death was weak and indecisive, much like his reign as a whole. He didn't seek revenge for his friend's murder. Instead, he mourned quietly and did little to punish those responsible. But the death of Piers Gaveston was only the beginning of Edward II's downfall. The anger that had been simmering among the nobility for years now erupted into full-blown rebellion. The nobles were emboldened by their success in eliminating Gaveston, and they began to challenge Edward's reign more openly. Meanwhile, Isabella, who had long grown disillusioned with her husband's rule, found herself increasingly isolated in the court. She was married to a man who could not control his kingdom, and she began to lose faith in his ability to protect her own interests. It wasn't long before Isabella found an ally in Roger Mortimer, one of the most powerful nobles in England. Mortimer was a man of ambition and power, someone who was willing to do whatever it took to advance his own position. Together, Isabella and Mortimer began to plot against Edward II, conspiring to remove him from power once and for all. By 1326, they had gathered enough support from disillusioned nobles to launch a rebellion. They returned to England with an army and quickly gained the allegiance of the English people, who were fed up with Edward's weak leadership. Edward II, unable to defend his throne, had no choice but to surrender. In January 1327, he was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his son, Edward III, who was just a teenager at the time. This moment marked the official end of Edward II's reign, but it was not the end of his story. The nobles who had orchestrated his downfall didn't simply want him removed from the throne. They wanted to ensure that he would never be a threat again. Isabella and Mortimer had Edward II imprisoned, but they didn't stop there. They feared that, even in prison, Edward might somehow escape or rally supporters and attempt to reclaim his throne. They were determined to eliminate him completely, to ensure that there would be no chance of a comeback. What followed is one of the most gruesome and horrifying deaths in English history. The details of Edward II's death are chilling and remain a subject of debate among historians. The most famous account is that Edward was murdered in a horrific manner by having a red-hot poker shoved up into his body. Some historians believe that this gruesome method was used to make it appear as though Edward had died of natural causes, but in reality, it was a cold-blooded murder designed to be both humiliating and irreversible. The story of the red-hot poker is one of medieval legend, and while some believe it to be true, others argue that it was simply a fabrication to make Edward's death seem even more shocking. Whatever the method of his execution, one thing is clear. Edward II died in a manner that was as gruesome as it was humiliating, ensuring that he would never return to power and would be forever remembered for his tragic and bitter end. To fully understand the depth of Edward II's downfall, it's important to examine not only the key players involved, but also the context of the time, the political environment, and the social dynamics that ultimately led to his demise. As we've already established, Edward II's reign was marked by a lack of decisive leadership, his favoring of certain individuals over others, and his failure to manage the expectations of the English nobility. But these issues didn't arise in a vacuum. Edward was born into a world that expected strength and authority from his monarchs, and his inability to meet these expectations would prove disastrous. England in the early 14th century was a kingdom that had been forged through military conquest, the inheritance of vast lands, and the establishment of power through force. The nobility were powerful figures in their own right, and kingship wasn't just about lineage. It was about strength, the ability to lead armies, and most importantly, keeping the peace between crown and the nobles. Edward II failed at all of these things. One of the primary causes of the discontent that brewed around Edward was his relationship with the aristocracy. The English nobility, powerful families who controlled large swathes of land and had military influence, were expected to be loyal to crown. But in return, the monarch was supposed to respect their power, grant them privileges, and ensure that their status wasn't undermined. Edward II didn't just fail to respect this balance. He tipped it drastically in favor of those who he personally favored, particularly Piers Gaveston. This favoritism wasn't simply a personal issue between the king and his nobles. It was a direct threat to the stability of the kingdom itself. Gaveston's rise within the court of Edward II was like a storm brewing in the distance. He was a man of humble origins, not a noble by birth, yet Edward made him a favorite in the court. Gaveston was not just a king's friend. He was a companion who seemed to possess the king's ear on almost every decision. To the nobles, this was unacceptable. In medieval England, power was maintained by birthright, status, and respect for traditional hierarchies. Gaveston's presence, someone with no noble title or military prowess, was seen as an insult. This wasn't simply an issue of jealousy. It was an existential threat to the nobility's position. If a commoner could rise to such heights, what would stop others from doing the same? Edward's relationship with Gaveston was the spark that ignited the fire of rebellion. To make matters worse, when Edward II was confronted by the nobility over his favoring of Gaveston, he responded with arrogance. Instead of recognizing the underlying tensions and trying to make concessions, Edward doubled down. His inability to empathize with the concerns of his nobles only worsened the situation. It showed that he was a king who either didn't understand or simply didn't care about the complex dynamics of medieval politics. The decision to exile Gaveston in 1312, though seen as a political compromise, was short-lived. Edward, unwilling to let go of his friend, broke the agreement and brought Gaveston back into England in 1313. This act of defiance against his own barons marked the point of no return. The nobility, led by Thomas of Lancaster, had no choice but to take matters into their own hands. They captured Gaveston, and this time they didn't just exile him, they executed him. The execution of Gaveston was not a simple act of rebellion. It was a message. It sent a clear warning to Edward that the aristocracy was in charge, and he was not. The gruesome manner of Gaveston's execution was meant to humiliate Edward. Gaveston was beheaded, and his body was displayed for all to see. This public spectacle showed the power of the barons and the inability of Edward to protect his closest ally. What's perhaps even more significant is how Edward responded to Gaveston's death. He didn't seek revenge, didn't rally his forces, and didn't even show much anger. This lack of action showed how weak his position had become. Meanwhile, Isabella, Edward II's wife, was growing increasingly disillusioned with her husband. Although Isabella had initially married Edward as part of a political alliance with France, their marriage was strained from the start. Edward II's inability to be a strong king, his closeness to Piers Gaveston, and his refusal to take control of the situation left Isabella feeling isolated. She was a daughter of King Philip IV of France, a powerful and ambitious monarch who understood the importance of maintaining a strong, respected rule. Isabella was not content to be married to a man who seemed incapable of ruling his own kingdom. As Edward's reign grew more unstable, Isabella's frustration reached a boiling point. She began to seek the counsel of Roger Mortimer, a nobleman who had been exiled from England. Mortimer, known for his ambition and military prowess, quickly became a key figure in the plot to overthrow Edward. Together, Isabella and Mortimer began to plan a rebellion to remove Edward from the throne. The situation became even more tense when Isabella began to form alliances with key figures within the English nobility, including those who had been involved in the rebellion against Edward's favoritism towards Gaveston. They saw in Isabella a figure who could bring stability to the kingdom, someone who could replace Edward II with a more competent ruler. By 1326, Isabella and Mortimer had gathered enough support to launch a full-scale invasion of England. They landed in the country with an army, and it wasn't long before they had taken control. Edward II, who had once commanded great respect, was now faced with a full-scale rebellion against his rule. His inability to rally his forces or gain the support of his nobility left him helpless. Isabella and Mortimer easily gained control of the kingdom, and the once powerful king found himself utterly defeated. Edward was forced to surrender and abdicate the throne in favor of his young son, Edward III, in January 1327. His abdication was a formal recognition that his reign had ended and that he no longer had any power to influence the kingdom. Edward II's downfall was swift, but it wasn't over. His captors weren't simply content to remove him from the throne. They wanted to ensure that he could never be a threat again. They feared that, given time, Edward might try to escape and rally supporters to take back the crown. And so, Edward II was imprisoned in various locations, watched closely by Isabella and Mortimer, who would stop at nothing to ensure that he remained a prisoner. But the question remains, what led to the brutal end of Edward II? How did the once mighty king, who had been raised in an environment where strength and dominance were expected, meet such a humiliating and horrific death? Edward's tragic end wasn't the result of just one decision or one mistake. It was a culmination of years of political missteps, poor leadership, and a failure to maintain control over the very people who had the power to make or break him. Some historians argue that the method of Edward II's death, whether it involved the infamous red-hot poker or some other form of execution, was designed to be both a punishment and a warning. If there was any question about how far those in power were willing to go to remove a king who had failed, Edward's death answered it in the most gruesome way possible. The intention behind this brutal execution wasn't just to end his life. It was to erase him from history, as if he had never been king at all. The humiliation, the brutality, and the secretive nature of his death all served to ensure that Edward II will be remembered not for his reign, but for his dramatic and tragic fall from power. Is it possible that the true story of Edward II's death will never be fully known? Perhaps. Some say that the accounts we have are exaggerated, perhaps even fabricated, to make the king's death seem even more horrific than it really was. But whatever the exact details, the idea that a king could meet such a brutal and disgraceful end speaks volumes about the treacherous world of medieval politics and the fragility of power. And that's where the story of King Edward II takes a truly tragic turn. A king once full of potential, who could have ruled with strength and wisdom, reduced to a mere footnote in history due to a series of catastrophic failures. Edward's reign, which began with promise, ended in humiliation and terror. His downfall wasn't the result of one isolated event, but rather a long buildup of poor decisions, fractured relationships, and an inability to manage the very system of power that had placed him on the throne in the first place. Edward II's reign offers a stark reminder that power, in medieval England, wasn't just a matter of birthright. It was about the ability to command loyalty, the strength to make tough decisions, and the wisdom to manage relationships with the powerful nobility. Edward, unfortunately, lacked all three. He was a king who seemed to be in a constant battle with his own court, his nobles, and even his own family. Whether it was his bond with Piers Gaveston or his failure to respond effectively to the rising opposition of the barons, Edward showed time and again that he wasn't the kind of leader England needed. His refusal to see or admit his own weaknesses and the dangers they posed his throne would cost him everything. But what makes Edward II's story even more haunting is not just the political intrigue or the betrayal. It's the tragic way in which he ended his life. The gruesome and humiliating manner of his death ensured that he would never be remembered as a king who ruled with authority. Instead, his name would be forever associated with weakness, betrayal, and one of the most brutal ends a monarch has ever suffered. His death is a sobering commentary on the vulnerability of monarchs in an era where power was fragile and often fleeting. In medieval times, kings didn't just rule. They were constantly under the threat of rebellion, assassination, and the manipulations of those around them. Edward II's tragic fate shows how quickly a king could go from being at the pinnacle of power to being completely powerless. His reign proves that even kings who come to power through bloodlines and birthrights are not guaranteed to keep their crowns. Instead, it's about the ability to navigate the complex web of politics, alliances, and rivalries. The betrayal that Edward experienced is a key factor in the destruction of his reign. When we look at the people who turned against him, his wife Isabella, his former allies, and the nobles who felt betrayed by his favoritism toward Gaveston, it's clear that Edward's greatest flaw was his inability to maintain loyalty. What started as personal relationships, particularly with Gaveston, slowly turned into political liabilities. When his nobles saw him as weak and indecisive, they knew they could capitalize on his vulnerability. And when Isabella, once his loyal queen, turned against him, it was the final blow to Edward's rule. Edward's personal relationships with the people he trusted the most, those closest to him, ultimately led to his downfall. His attachment to Gaveston, his refusal to respect the wishes of his wife and his barons, and his failure to address the growing anger and discontent in his court all contributed to the collapse of his reign. Edward II's downfall is a reminder that loyalty in politics is something that must be carefully managed. A ruler who cannot maintain the loyalty of their key supporters risks losing everything. But Edward II's life, and especially his death, serves as more than just a historical lesson. It speaks to the broader themes of power, betrayal, and human frailty. It shows us how the fragile nature of power can be eroded by even small mistakes. It reminds us that history is full of rulers who started with great promise, but ended in disgrace, not because of some single event, but because they were unable to adapt to the ever-changing world around them. Edward II's reign was also a time of great political and social turmoil. The instability of the period is reflected in the growing divide between the monarchy and the nobility. The barons who opposed Edward weren't just discontent with his rule. They were reacting to a broader problem that faced England at the time. The power of the crown was challenged by the rising influence of the nobility, who were determined to exert their influence over the kingdom. The tensions that existed between the monarchy and the aristocracy were a direct result of the changing dynamics of medieval society. As the nobility became more powerful, the king's position grew more tenuous. Edward's inability to understand this shift, to adapt to these changing political realities, ultimately led to his downfall. Edward II's death is tragic, not because he died in battle, but because he didn't fight at all. Unlike many monarchs who met their end in a heroic act, Edward's demise was passive. He was deposed, imprisoned, and killed in a gruesome manner that became a dark legend. His lack of resistance highlights how fragile power is. Even for a king, his story is also a cautionary tale of isolation. Betrayed by those closest to him and left without allies, Edward became a prisoner of his own making. His failure to build strong relationships or alliances left him vulnerable. The brutal nature of his execution symbolized the harshness of medieval politics. Kings who couldn't assert power were swiftly disposed of, and Edward's fate serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of losing control. His tragic death marked the end of an unstable era and the beginning of Edward III's reign, which shaped England for generations. Edward II's life and death are a powerful reminder that power is fleeting, loyalty hard to maintain, and even kings can fall from grace.